Hello, good people. It's wonderful to be back with you. I am very happy to be able to share with you the next part of Chapter 1 of Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. I know it seems like it's taken a long time to get through the first chapter. It's very complex and so requires a bit of time. I think you'll find it rewarding. Okay, so for this section, Ratzinger starts off mentioning Descartes and Kant and the way they changed human ideas about what can be known. No, he just mentions them very quickly. He doesn't go into any detail. If you are interested in reviewing how they changed the way we think about what we can know, I would suggest that you look at John Vervaeke's lectures about them in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, and I will put links to them in the description. However, the thinker that Ratzinger wants to focus on is a different one, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But first, what he wants to do is describe the way that human beings thought they knew things and what they could know through the ancient world and into the Middle Ages. So this is what he says. For the ancient world and the Middle Ages, being itself is true. And he's going to refer to a Latin phrase as he goes through this a couple of times, and it's virum est ens. That is, truth is being. To continue with Ratzinger, in other words, apprehensible. That is, truth is being and it's apprehensible because God, pure intellect, made it, and he made it by thinking it. To the creative original spirit, the creator spiritus, thinking and making are one and the same thing. His thinking is a creative process. Things are because they are thought. In the ancient and medieval view, all being is therefore what has been thought, the thought of the absolute spirit. Conversely, this means that since all being is thought, all being is meaningful. Logos, truth. It follows from this traditional view that human thinking is the rethinking of being itself, rethinking of the thought that is being itself. Man can rethink the logos, the meaning of being, because his own logos, his own reason is logos of the one logos. Thought of the original thought, of the creative spirit that permeates and governs his being. Being is thought, and therefore thinkable, the object of thought and of the science that strives after wisdom. I want to read that last sentence one more time. Being is thought, and therefore thinkable. The object of thought. So being is the object of our thought, right? And it's also the object of the science that strives after wisdom. So you see here this connection between thinking about being, apprehending being, and pursuing a science or a knowledge of wisdom. And of course, in the last few lectures, John Vervaeke's been talking about the way that wisdom can be pursued. And so this is, if you're interested in what he's been saying, I think you'll find this also interesting. Now, what I want to point out here is something that Ratzinger just puts in a little brief footnote, but I want to elaborate on it just a little bit. During the ancient times, this is, the ancient Greeks through into the Christian era, there was certain variation of thought regarding participation of the natural world in logos. So there was a thought that there was pure being, and then there were graduations of participation in logos as you got down into the material world, the natural world. As you get closer to Christian times, in the Stoics thought that the natural world was very connected with logos, that logos was in the natural world. And of course, Philo, the Hellenized Jewish philosopher who lived very close to the time of Christ, in fact, his life overlaps that of Christ somewhat, he thought that he would consider the logos to be kind of like the, you might say, the operating system of the universe, of the cosmos, or the source code for all of the natural order. So we move to an idea of a kind of a suspicion that the natural world might not really be that connected with logos, to kind of having a more firm belief that logos is expressed in the natural world. And as we go through into the Christian times, that connects up with the idea of creation ex nihilo, that is, creation from nothing, that the natural order is itself thought of by God. But to the ancients, some thought that the natural world itself was just as eternal as God, and they were not necessarily connected in the same way that we think of it as Christians, or as Jews thought of it, as being created from nothing by God. So this makes a change, and what this means is that as we move into Christian times, there comes to be a very firm conception that when we look at the natural world, we can look through it to the thinking of God. Now, where does the work of man fit into this schema? Well, the work of man seems to be, Ratzinger says, contingent and transitory. So the things that human beings made are not as full of the logos as the things in the natural world or being itself. Ratzinger goes on to say, the work of man, on the other hand, is a mixture of logos and the alogical. That would mean the non-logos. Something, moreover, that with the passage of time sinks away into the past. It does not admit of full comprehension, for it is lacking in presence, the prerequisite for being looked at, and it is lacking in logos, in thoroughgoing meaningfulness. For this reason, ancient and medieval philosophy took the view that knowledge of human things could only be techne, manual skill, but never real cognition, and hence never real science. Therefore, in the medieval university, the arts remained only the first step to real science, which reflects on being itself. So real science, which equals real knowledge, remember the word science in this case just means knowledge. Real science, real knowledge reflects on being itself. Now, I said that there was a philosopher other than Descartes and Kant who Ratzinger is going to focus his attention on. And this is someone that you may not have heard of. He lived and worked between Descartes and Kant. And it's the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico. And Ratzinger says, quote, that he coined the typical formula of the modern spirit when it comes to dealing with the question of truth and reality. Against the scholastic equation, verum est ens, being is truth, he advances his own formula, verum quia factum. Truth is what is made. Now, this word factum in Latin has a lot of translations into English, but the one that Ratzinger is really focused on, the particular implication of the word in this case, factum, is that something that has been accomplished, something that has been done, or something that has been made. And so Ratzinger says that this represents the real end of the old metaphysics and the beginning of the specifically modern attitude of mind. quote, Vico was to turn the Middle Ages criterion of truth on its head, thus giving expression to the fundamental revolution that marks the arrival of the modern spirit. This was the start of the attitude that introduces the scientific age in which we are still living. Following formally in Aristotle's footsteps, he asserts that real knowledge is the knowledge of causes. I am familiar with a thing if I know the cause of it. I understand something that has been proved if I know the proof, unquote. So what is it that we know the proof of? Things we have made. So this is going to begin to constrain what we consider to be real knowledge. And real knowledge, humans are going to conclude, is going to be found in math and history. Now, Descartes himself was kind of suspicious that history was real knowledge. He was very sure that math was real knowledge. He was very sure that if you used mathematical type of reasoning, that the conclusions you came to were certain. However, when it came to history, Descartes was pretty suspicious. He had commented that if you knew Roman history, you still knew less than what a kitchen maid in Caesar's kitchen would know of Roman history. So he did not think of history as very certain knowledge, but he was very sure about math. However, history was going to come in as a big deal, as Ratzinger is going to mention in just a moment. Quote, in the midst of the sea of doubt that threatened to engulf man at the beginning of the modern period after the collapse of the old metaphysics, the factum was here discovered as the dry land on which man could try to build a new existence for himself. The dominance of the fact began, that is, man's complete devotion to his own work as the only certainty. Thus, mathematics and history now became the dominant disciplines. Indeed, history devoured, so to speak, the whole world of learning and transformed it all fundamentally, unquote. So Ratzinger goes on to point out that Hegel is going to turn philosophy historical, with being itself understood as a historical process. Theology is going to turn into historical research. Marx will make economics into history. And then with Darwin, all of biology becomes history, the history of the lines of descent of the living things. And finally, anthropology also becomes history, with man looking for clues to his origin through archaeology and paleontology. Now, Ratzinger presents this as a kind of fall of the human logos. The logos that was understood to be the power to look up to being, and actually Plato had posited that the origin of the word anthropos had to do with the one who looks up, that man, that's the Greek word for man, because man is the one who looks up, right? That the power to look up has now turned its gaze downward to grub around in the dust for answers. So it's like logos has fallen. And then Ratzinger goes on to say, quote, here too, the heaven from which he seemed to come was torn down, so to speak, and he was left with just the earth and its facts in his hand, the earth in which he now sought with a spade to decipher the laborious history of his development, unquote. So man can only know his own work, his own past accomplishments. But what are those? If man is only an advanced state, how are his accomplishments of any greater worth than, say, a beehive or a bird's nest or a beaver dam, right? So Ratzinger says, quote, this program that directs man to history as the receptacle of truth could not suffice, unquote. See, as this program regarding history continued, it became clear that it's a disputable thing. It was subject to interpretation and ambiguity. Once again, the certainty of knowledge slips through man's hands. The turn from being to fact to what has been made has not satisfied him. So then along comes Marx, who says, so far philosophers have merely interpreted the world in various ways. It is necessary to change it. Ratzinger says, quote, translated into the language of the philosophical tradition, this maxim meant that verum quia factum, what is knowable, tending toward truth, is what man has made and what he can now contemplate, was replaced by the new program, verum quia faciendum. The truth with which we are now concerned is feasibility, what we can make. In other words, not what we made in the past, but what we can make. Quote, to put it again in another way, the truth with which man is concerned is neither the truth of being, nor even in the last resort that of his accomplished deeds, but the truth of changing the world, molding the world, a truth centered on future and action, unquote. So now if what dominates the concern of men is the makeable, we understand why Techne, that's technology, rules the day. Conviction will be with what man can put on the table before him. Remember in the first part of this chapter, that statement about from the Jewish rabbi who said that no one can lay God and his kingdom on the table before another man. But man has something he can lay on the table before him, and that would be especially his repeatable experiments. They're so much more certain than history, because in history you have no control. You don't have a control history that you can compare the history that happens with. You can't replicate it, so there's no replication in history. So now we have seen a complete switch around, because in the past, in the ancient world, Techne was the lower order of learning, of science. Being was at the top. The natural science were in the middle, and then Techne, what man made, was on the bottom. But now, Ratzinger says, quote, Techne has become the real potential and obligation of man. What was previously at the bottom is now on top. Simultaneously, the perspective is changing once again. At first, in ancient and medieval times, man had concentrated on the eternal. Then, during the short-lived predominance of the historical approach, on the past. But now, the faciendum, the makeable aspect of things, directs his attention to the future of what he himself can create. If before, perhaps, through the conclusions implicit in the doctrine of the origin of species, he might have resignedly noted that so far as his past was concerned, he was just Earth, a mere chance development. If he was disillusioned by such knowledge and felt degraded, he does not need to be disturbed by this any longer, for now, wherever he comes from, he can look his future in the eye with a determination to make himself into whatever he wishes, unquote. Now, Ratzinger is very prescient in this observation. Now, at the time that he's writing this book, which is 1968, we haven't yet entered the time of the questions about genetic manipulation and AI. That's something that we're now concerned with. But he says, quote, what already seems more important than the theory of evolution, which for practical purposes already lies behind us as something self-evident, is cybernetics, the planability of the newly to be created man, so that theologically, too, the manipulation of man by his own planning is beginning to represent a more important problem than the question of man's past, although the two questions cannot be separated from each other and in their general tendency largely govern each other reciprocally. The reduction of man to a fact is the precondition for understanding him as a faciendum, which is to be led out of its own resources into a new future, unquote. So it took the fall of logos, of human intellect, from seeking to know being to focusing his concern on what has been made, and then to lead to the technological presumption that man can make himself into something else. And Ratzinger notes that the question of man's origin cannot be disconnected from questions about man's future. These are theological questions at their base. So what is then the place of theology with regard to the historical question and to the feasibility question? In other words, in regard to the question of what has been made in the past and regarding what man may make in the future. What do we say as Christians about Marx's idea of changing the world? What about the hope that some people have that that technological progress could have some kind of role in salvation history? Ratzinger doesn't want to casually dismiss this worldly concerns for the sake of elevating man's thought to being once more. Instead, he wants to reframe the issue raised by attention to the historical and by attention to the technological future. Quote, "But it is just as wrong here to jump to conclusions as it is to pass swift judgment. When either of the two approaches described above, that would be looking to the past or looking to make things in the future, when either of the two approaches described above is adopted exclusively and belief is consigned wholly to the plane of the fact or of makeability, in the end, this only conceals what it really means when a man says, credo, I believe. For when he says this, he is not primarily enunciating a program for changing the world or simply attaching himself to a chain of historical events. By way of an attempt to shed some light on what is really involved, I should like to suggest that the act of believing does not belong to the relationship of know, make." So he writes it like this. He writes know-make, which is typical of the intellectual context of makeability thinking. But it is much better expressed in the quite different relationship stand, understand, and he writes it as stand-understand. It seems to me that here we can discern two general conceptions and possibilities of human existence that, though not unconnected with each other, must nevertheless be distinguished from each other, unquote. So that distinction between the know-make kind of thought and the stand-understand position, that is what he is going to take up in the next part of chapter 1, and that will be the subject of my last video on chapter 1. So thank you for being with me through this rather complicated material, and I look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible, so am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.